Hi everyone. In our last episode, we started talking about variables and basic code structure. Today we're going to start talking about functions. Now, as our code gets larger and more complex, we're going to need to find a way to organize our code to make it easier to understand not only for us, but others who are using and writing our code. And the number one way of doing that is with functions. Now, functions are basically just taking a group of commands or statements and combining them together into a named function that we can call multiple times. So with that brief interview, let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Now imagine that we're creating a single player game where we have to roll a six-sided die and output the result to the player. Pretty simple right now, but over time this may get more complex. So in order to simulate the roll of a die, we need to generate a random number between 1 and 6. Now, JavaScript gives us the ability to generate a random number, but it only gives us the ability to generate a number between 0 and 1 with decimal places. So we could get a number like 0.1234 or 0.789 or anything like that. It's going to be a lot longer in the decimals, but it gives us a random number between 0 and 1. Now, that doesn't really help us if we need to get an integer, or a number without any decimals, between 1 and 6, but it's a great way to start. So let's go ahead and start writing some code and see how we can get from a random number between 0 and 1 into a random integer between 1 and 6. So to get started, we're going to need to get that base number between 0 and 1. So to do that, let's create a constant called const base number equals, and this is going to be an ability that JavaScript or Node gives us, and it's going to be math with a capital M, which is important, dot random, and you open close parentheses, semicolon. So what this is saying is, give us a random number between 0 and 1 with decimals, that's what math.random is, and assign it to a constant called base number. And we can show this by saying console.log base number. And if we run this over here, we do node functions.js, we're going to get 0.214 blah blah blah. And if we run it again, we're going to get a different random number, and again and again. So every time we run it, we're going to get a different random number. And so this is our base for generating a random six-sided die. So now what we can do is say, well, we have a number between 0 and 1. If we multiply that, we're then going to get a number between 0 and 6 if we multiply it by 6. So we say const multiplied number equals base number times, and we use the asterisk for a multiplication, times 6, semicolon again to end the statement. And now if we do console.log multiplied number and run it over here, we're now going to get a number between 0 and 6 at the most. So you see we have the 3.77, 5.79, 0.93, 1.79, etc. Now we're getting closer, but again, we don't want those decimals because dice don't have decimals. And so we're going to use one more feature that Node gives us, and so we're going to get const result, because this is going to be the die result, is equal to math.ceil, and I'll explain this in a second, multiplied number. Now, math.ceil basically says whatever your number is, round it up. So there are also functions like math.round, which would round up if it's higher than 0.5, or round down if it's lower than that. There's also a math.floor, which is the opposite of ceil. So in a math.floor, 3.77 would be turned into 3, 5.79. Even though it would be rounded up, even though these would be rounded up in a normal rounding, we're always going to take the lowest. But in this case, we're going to want to do math.ceil, so always round it up. So a 3.77 would become a 4, a 5.79 would become a 6, and the 0.93 would get rounded up into a 1. So now, if we come back over here, we console.log result, we can come over here, run it one more time, and now you'll see we get a nice integer every time. So we get fours and ones a lot, evidently. But if we keep running it, we're going to get everything between 6 and 1. We'll never get a 0 because up above, if the result was a 0 point whatever, we're using math.ceil over here to round it up. And we'll never get higher than a 6 because the highest possible number we're going to get in math.random is going to be a 1. 1 times 6 is going to be 6. 6 even, rounded up, is still going to be 6 because there is no decimal point. So we'll always get a number between 1 and 6. Now that's all well and good, but what happens if suddenly our designers say, you know what? We don't want it to be a single player game, or we don't want to just roll one die. We want to roll multiple dice for multiple people. Now we're going to have this weird issue where we come over here, and if we want to roll 2 dice for our player, we have to do this again. But now we're going to run into an issue because, well, base number has already been defined up here. Multiplied number has already been defined up here. Results already been defined up here. If we console.log result, and then come over here and console.log result again, if we run this, we're going to get those errors because we're trying to redefine our constants. Now, some of you may say, well, we talked about lets in the last episode. We could change all of our const to lets and then redefine it down here, right? Const base lets, not lets, let base number equals math.random and reassign it down here. That would work. But now, what happens if we have 4 players that want to roll 4 dice each? We're going to have 16 lines of code all doing pretty much the exact same thing. So we're going to have to rethink this a little bit. And so fortunately, we have a thing called a function. Now what we can do is I'm going to come over here and comment these out. And you just hold, if you select multiple lines in Visual Studio Code, you hit Control and the slash button. It will comment out your lines or uncomment them and toggle between that. And so let's just leave those here so that we have a reference. And what we can do is we can create what's called a function, which is going to be a reusable set of code. So in order to define a function, we say const, and then whatever we want to name our function. So it's kind of like declaring a variable. And at the end of the day, a function is a variable, which will get very important later on. So we do const roll die is equal to open close parentheses equals, and then the greater than sign, and then open and close braces. Now this is a lot going on, and we're going to go into a lot more detail over time. But just know that we're saying I'm declaring a function called roll die, and that everything that we do in here between these 2 curly braces is going to run every time we ask roll die to run. So if we copy over here and put it in, let's then uncomment these lines. And if we come down here and we say, in order to make our function run, we do roll die, and then we do open and close parentheses. Now if we save and run this, what we're going to see is we're going to get number 6. So we're going to say, and let's change this back to a const just to make me feel a little bit better, because we're never reassigning the base number in here. We want to keep it as const. So we're saying roll die and open and close parentheses. What we're saying is find a function called roll die and run it. If we just do roll die without the parentheses, nothing's going to happen. We don't get any output. Those open and close parentheses are very important in order to say, I want to run this function. So what's happening now is roll die, we're calling it, it's coming up here and it's saying, okay, everything within these curly braces is what we're going to run. So it's going to run base number equals math.random, multiplied number equals base number times 6, result equals math.ceil, and then we output the result. Now, because this is a function, what do you think is going to happen over here? We have these consts, and up here when we redefine const, we threw an error. What do you think is going to happen if we roll die again? If we run it, we're now going to get 5 and 3, so it ran twice and output the result. And there's no errors at all like there was up here. And the reason for that and we'll get into that a little bit more in the future, is that everything that's run within these braces, it's basically setting the variables in these braces, and then when we come out of the function, everything that was created in here is basically destroyed. So every time we run this, and we can run it multiple times, every time we run it, it's going to create these variables, it's going to output the result, and then it's going to destruct everything and start over new. And then next time we run roll die, it's going to come back through, it's going to run it all again, and then destroy over and over and over. And so we can run this as many times as we want, however many times we want, and there's never going to be any issues because it's always going to create everything, output it, and then destroy it. Now that's all well and good, but what happens if we want to roll the die and then do some mathematical equations with it? Or what if we're going to want to roll the die multiple different places and do different things with the result based on what the result is? So let's say, for example, we wanted to say console.log player1 rolled, and then we put out whatever the value is. So we want to say, in here, we want to say, roll die. Well, let's see what happens if we take out these braces here that I was using as an example. But let's see what happens if we do a console.log player1 rolled plus roll die. And you want to have this space here, otherwise you're going to not have a space between the roll and the result. Let's see what happens here. We're going to get 3, which is what the player rolled, but then we're going to get player1 rolled undefined. Well, that's not very helpful because this looks ugly and it doesn't really help us at all. So one thing we can do that functions are great at is we can run this code and have it do some computations and return whatever the computation is back to whoever called it. So what we can do is we can say, let's comment out this line for a second. Let's say we wanted to console.log roll die this way. We say, once it's done doing all of its computation, let's return the result back to whoever called it. And so now we're saying roll die, where we want to console.log whatever roll die is returning. And this return statement is saying, okay, whatever we do up here, we store the result in a variable called result, and then we return it. So console.log roll die should, once again, we're no longer console.log inside the function, we're doing the result of the function, and if we try it again, we're going to get it. So console.log roll die does whatever it wants to do, it returns it, and brings it back. And so we could do another function. Let's go ahead and comment this out for a second, just to show exactly what's going on. We could do a const, if I can spell, const multiply numbers equals open close parentheses, again equal, and then the greater sign, and open and close braces. And you want that semicolon on the end. We can return 8 times 7, which is 56. If we console.log multiply numbers, and then again we want to invoke the function, make the function run by doing open and close parentheses, and then that semicolon on the end. If we save, we should console.log whatever we're returning from this function, which is multiply numbers is returning 8 times 7, which I believe is 56. Yes. So there you go. Anytime we say return, whatever value we give it is going to get brought back in here. And right now, we're only really using console.logs to output, but what we could do is say console.log multiply numbers, which is returning us a number, multiply that by 7, and now we're going to console.log whatever 56 times 7 is, which should be 392. So we're saying whatever the result of this function is, multiply it times 7, and then output the result to the console. So now we can do some really cool things by having a group of functions that do some sort of computation for us and then return it. So now, anytime we want to roll a die, we don't have to do all of this just to get the result. We just call roll die, and it will return a number between 1 and 6, and we can console.log it. We can now say roll die, multiply it times, let's just get rid of this. So take a die and multiply it times 7, and now we're going to get some number that is a multiple of 7. So whatever the random number is, multiply it times 7. And now we can come back here and say player 1 roll die. And if we run it, we see player 1 rolled 1. Player 1 rolled 6. Player 1 rolled 2. Now we can take this one step forward. If we want to add multiple players, we can do, let's say we want to have 4 players. We do player 1, player 3, player 4. If we save this and run this, what do you think is going to happen? I think we're going to get 4 lines saying player 1 rolled and a random number, player 2 rolled a random number, and so on and so forth. And there we go. So player 1, 2, and 3 rolled a 2, player 4 rolled a 1. If we run it again, 3, 5, 6, 3, etc. Now, remember at the beginning I said functions are great for grouping code, and they're also good for reducing duplication of code. Now, if you look over here, we see player 1 rolled, player 2 rolled, player 3 rolled, player 4 rolled. There's a lot of duplication here. In fact, this whole line is identical except for the 1, 2, 3, and 4. What if there was a way we could create a function where we specify what the player number is and then have them roll a die for that? So let's comment this out again. And let's create a function called const roll die for player. And then we're going to do open close parentheses. We're going to do it's called fat arrow. And then the open close braces. And we want the semicolon at the end. So now what we can say is console.log player. And for now, we'll just do player 1 rolled plus roll die again. And then if we come down here, we say roll die for player. If we run this, we're once again going to get player 1 rolled 4. Now, functions have the ability to accept arguments. Arguments are basically saying, whenever I run this function, create a temporary variable and use it. So let's say here, and in these parentheses, this is where we specify what our arguments are. We can say player number, and then if we change this out, let's player 1 plus, we're getting those extra quotes, player number plus. So now we're saying roll die for player. Player, and then whatever we pass to player number, and we'll get to that in a second, rolled, and then the result of, let's move this over so we can see it a little better, roll die. So if we save this and run it, we're going to get player undefined rolled 2. And that's because we never specified what we want player number to be. So now down here we can say, I want player number 1 to equal, or player number to equal 1. So when we say roll die for player and 1, this is going to map, so this 1 is going to get put into player number, and then console.log player 1 rolled a die. So player 1 rolled 5. We could change this to player Todd again, because that's my name. Player Todd rolled 2. Whatever we put in here, we're basically, behind the scenes, there's a let player number equals whatever was passed in the function. So whatever we put here is going to get stored in a temporary variable called player number. So whatever we put in these parentheses is going to get plugged into a variable named player number. And then we console.log player, whatever we passed in, rolled, and then the result of this function up here. So let's go ahead and close this out. And now we can do something really simple. So if we wanted to do 4 players, we do roll die for player, and then we say player 1. And then if we copy down here, say 4, 3, 2. Boom. Player 1 rolled 2, player 2 rolled 4, player 3 rolled 4, and player 4 rolled a 6. So whatever this value is going to get plugged in right here. Now, to take it one more step, and this will be the last step for this episode, is that functions can accept multiple arguments. So back before when we made that const multiply number, we were returning that 8 times 7, and then console.log multiply number. If we run this, and let's comment this out so we don't get too much in our console, we're going to get that number 56. Well, what if we don't want it to always be 8 times 7? What if we want to specify 2 different numbers? Well, here we can say, let's accept 2 different arguments. So we can call it number 1, number 2. And then down here we need to change this so that it's number 1, number 2. And then down here we can say, well, I want to multiply times 8 times 7 again. Or we could say, I want to multiply 3 times 5. So now if we do this and run it, we're going to get 15. So we're going to say, I'm creating a function called multiply number that accepts 2 arguments, which we're going to name number 1 and number 2. So now whenever we call multiply number, we are expecting that 2 different things are going to be passed. So this first value, 3, is going to get stored in a new variable called number 1. And the second value, 5, is going to get stored in a second variable called number 2. Now we can do whatever we want down here in the function with those variables. In this case, we're just multiplying them together. We could add them together, and then this result's going to be 8. We can do whatever we want with these variables. We just need to understand that these 2 variables are now available for us to use within this function. If we now try down here, return, or not return, oh my gosh, I can't type today, console.log number 1, what do you think is going to happen here? Let's try it and find out. We're going to get an error saying number 1 is not defined. And remember earlier we said within a function, these variables will only exist within these functions. So same if we were to, even though we declare a base number up here, if we were to console.log base number and run it, we're going to get an error up here saying base number is not defined. So it's very important to understand that any variable you declare within a function or any argument that is used within a function only exists within these curly braces. Once this function ends, those variables no longer exist. Number 1 has no meaning outside of multiply number, and base number has no meaning outside of roll die. Once that function closes, those variables no longer exist, which is very important to understand. So just to practice our understanding, let's see if we can do a practice problem. Let's say we want to have multiple sized dice in our game, so it's not always going to be a 6-sided die. How can we update our roll die function to accept any number and return a number between 1 and that number? So why don't you think about that for a second, try it out for yourself, and I'll come back in a minute and see if we can figure it out together. All right, so let's go ahead and clear this out for now because we aren't going to need it. And we're also not going to need this right now either. So how are we going to update the roll die to accept some number and output a number between 1 and that number? Well, to me, that sounds like we're going to be using an argument. So up here, we're going to say, we're going to tell the function to start accepting a new argument, and we'll call it max number. And then we can come down here and say, well, instead of base number times 6, it's not always going to be a 6-sided die. We're going to now want to multiply it by max number. And if we save this, and we say down here, console.log, roll die, and now let's pass in 20 and see what happens. We come over here, we're going to get 1, 17, 11, 20, 14, and you'll see if you keep running this, you're always going to get a number between 1 and now that 20. If we want to make it between 1 and 100, we just change the 100 here. We run it again, and we're going to get any number between 1 and 100. Now this is great because in our game we may want to have multiple different types of die, and we can just console.log here, and we say, well, I want to roll a 100-sided die, a 10-sided die, and a 6-sided die, and I want to output each of those results. And we're going to, if we run that, we're going to get 73, which is a number between 1 and 100. We're going to get 5, which is a number between 1 and 10, and we're going to get 3, which is a number between 1 and 6. And so by creating this function, we've made a really robust, reusable piece of code that we can use throughout our program wherever we want. And it's not going to cause any issues by us wanting to call it multiple times. We're not going to conflict with variable names or anything like that. So as you can see, functions are a really powerful tool for programming. We're able to create a piece of code that is reusable throughout our program without causing conflicts, without having to create a ton of new variables. It's a piece of code that is all contained within itself, and it just runs for us. And so anytime we need to now use that roll die or any other function we need to create, we can do that. And you saw also that functions can call other functions. So in the roll die for player, that was a function, but within that we called the roll die function. And you can have these multiple nested functions, and as your program gets more and more complex, you're going to find that you're using a ton of functions, because a good function is going to be very small, do one thing, and then you have functions that can call those and then interact with whatever the results are. So in our next episode, we're going to start talking about conditionals, which is a way for us to decide we don't always want to go one way down our code, right? The experience for someone who is logged in and someone who is not logged in is going to be completely different, and we need a way to differentiate between those two. And so in our next episode, we're going to be talking about conditionals, or ways to test whether something is one condition or the other. And so hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully you join us for the next video. And I'm really excited to be going on this adventure with you. So if you did find this video helpful, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. It will help you get notified when new videos come out. And we will see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.